How are you? How is everyone?
Personally, I'm doing good. Just
Good.
working on my project, trying to integrate everything I'm learning every day.
Okay, great, great. Glad to hear it. I wanted to start because there was so much input around editing from yesterday. I just wanted to kind of touch on that slightly and just kind of have a sense of if anyone had anything to say about editing, any other comments. We don't have to go into it a lot if people don't want to, but like I just thought I'd give the opportunity for anyone to say anything that they might not have been able to say yesterday. Is there any thoughts or anything anyone want to contribute anything about that? Any thoughts? Thanks to everyone for posting things in the group, especially the kind of tutorials. I know that there's only a few days left on this course, but please feel free to either WhatsApp me or email me after this course, has finished. If you have any questions or you have any thoughts or anything like that. Like we want to, like obviously there's people in the sort of Google group and we're kind of building that community, but also the people that are on these courses, we want, we'll kind of you're obviously free to, I know people don't always want to stay on a Google group for the rest of their lives, but I'll leave the Google group open, and if you want to stay on it, or if you just want to WhatsApp me directly, that's also fine. So let's kind of keep that open for the people that want it. I wanted to talk a little bit today about something that pretty much everyone who kind of teaches podcasting or any really like media where people have to create and then promote, distribute, and act as the sort of PR agent for their own media, they always say this sort of phrase where it's like you should spend as much time on all those things as you do on creating your content. And to be honest, if you are a journalist or a content creator, you probably don't do that. I think it's probably fair to say that even people that like I am saying now that you should spend a lot of time on it. I think if you're not forced to, or you kind of were left to your own devices, especially when you're producing your first podcast, you probably won't spend as much time on the distribution and the promotion and all those sorts of things. But the truth, and I guess it's kind of, I don't want to just tell you should definitely spend lots of time, because obviously everyone knows that, right? The more time you spend on social media and like all these sorts of things, then you will see some kind of results. But I think it's about kind of everyone finding a nice medium where they can kind of feel that they're putting effort in and it's time well spent. I think what is good to note that I have found, I'll just share a few things, is that on social media, obviously, if you have a huge following, which I don't have, but obviously, like how social media works, if you get picked up and retweeted, then that can help. But I don't personally have large following. And but when we have had good traction on social media, especially when we've done series through a portal in South Africa called News24 that have a massive Twitter following, a massive YouTube following, and they have flighted the podcast series and promoted it on their social media, we have had good uptake of the series. But the truth of the matter is people don't click through. So they've reported back on us that even though you obviously get good visibility if you partner with something like a News24, like essentially it'll be different in everyone's country, but like some kind of big news website, if you partner with them and you get them to host your podcast, I will say that often those kinds of, the market is such at the moment that if you produce a podcast series independently and then you approach a distribution channel, they might pay you. But we've kind of set up a relationship with News24 where they are a distribution partner. So they don't have influence over the editorial product, but then they also don't pay for the editorial product. They pay for to legally vet the podcast, which is great, which obviously is an expense. But we've kind of come to an agreement where the amount that they would probably pay wouldn't really make it worth it. And they've got other distribution deals with other podcasting production companies that are like we're a for-profit company, but they've got distribution deals with non-profit podcast creation companies. And essentially the way things have kind of gone is that these big portals know that their audience is valuable, and they know that they can often basically distribute your content without paying for it in some instances. And even if they pay for it, it probably won't be worth, on an hourly rate, how much it took to produce it, So, we have had situations where a distribution platform has paid for it, but then if you like really sat down and worked out the hourly rate of what they were paying for, it wouldn't be a great rate, essentially. So it's not, it's worth thinking of those sorts of, it's different if you sell a story to the BBC, for example, and then they brand it as a BBC product and you're the producer. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that or you shouldn't produce it, but I'm talking about more like if you produce something as an independent series or under your production company or under yourself or under your whatever it is, and then you just basically want it to retain all that identity, which we have with News 24. So it's like entirely branded as our thing, and they just distribute it. So anyway, so that's hopefully that's interesting, but there is something in that where if you work with social media, people won't necessarily, so you look at the tracking sometimes and you look at how many people have clicked on your tweet, for example. They've looked on the link of the podcast on your tweet and you're like, the number is so low that you're like, I can't even believe why we're bothering to do this. And the truth of the matter is people don't necessarily click through in that way when they're scrolling Twitter or even Facebook. But they will, it is kind of like in theory making an impact. And later when they're on their podcasting app or when they remember to, they will then search for it on their podcasting app. I saw today there were stats that Spotify has sort of, according to I think their own numbers, they've sort of surpassed everyone now as like the premium place internationally as for podcasting. Simultaneously, they're firing 200 people from their various podcasting outfits, which is Gimlet and The Ringer and a couple of others. So Spotify is simultaneously putting backing into podcasts in terms of becoming the app that people will use to listen to podcasts. But I'm sure, I don't know if you guys have seen, but simultaneously they're firing producers that work for Spotify that produce podcasts. And they're also releasing a bunch of podcasts that were originals for Spotify. So that means you could only listen to them on the Spotify app, which was a business model that was absolutely crazy and like no one really liked. And now they're releasing them from like Spotify jail, and they're now available on Apple Podcasts. So that was a super interesting model that Spotify, I'm sure you guys are aware of, Spotify has been trying for a few years, in that there are a number of Spotify originals that you can only listen to on the app. And I don't really use Spotify. I'm on Apple Music, so I don't really use Spotify for podcasts, apart from a couple of shows that I listen to that you can only listen to through Spotify, which makes an interesting thing, because today we're talking about obviously distribution and promotion, and where you've got these kind of walled gardens, and there's people like James Cridland, who runs the newsletter Pod News, where you can subscribe to it on podnews.net, and I recommend everyone signs up for that. It's a bit more, industry podcasting sometimes, but generally has pretty interesting articles about the podcasting landscape, and that's where I learned about these firings at Spotify. So yeah, definitely worth kind of keeping abreast of that sort of stuff, because when you're distributing or promoting or trying to sell your podcasting products, it's good to know, like, where are we, right? We've had like a big audio boom, and that's not going away. So the idea of like people listening to audio for their content is not diminishing in any way, but like across the board, also in video, but especially in audio compared to the last few years, big companies are tightening their belts in terms of spend on content. So that's not good news for anyone, including me, on this call. But it does kind of mean that especially if Spotify is releasing their grip on original content and people are listening to more audio, there is more opportunity in terms of people listening to your content, because more people will be listening to podcasts this year than last year, and next year there'll be even more. There's a horrible stat that I saw yesterday or 2 days ago, which was that something like a third of all podcast listens are the top 10 shows. Like, this is internationally, this isn't local. So that to me speaks to the fact that like people locally, like especially in Africa, in like specific, African countries, are listening to international shows largely, and it speaks to all media that they will want local shows, right? And probably in local languages. So you're sort of dealing with the devil in that way. If you make something incredibly local and in a specific local language, then you might capture that audience that otherwise is just listening to international content and starved for local content. But then, like anyone who makes something a bit too local, it might fail to make traction on an international market. And I think that's something that I'd love to hear, even if not today, then down the road when you guys launch your projects, how you balance that. Because I think I've had instances where some projects have had a bigger international reach when the story is, just feels less local. Like, we've had projects where people have complained about accents, even though it's all been in English. People have complained about accents. People have complained about kind of like we did an assassination story, and it did do well, but people complained internationally. They complained about it being unrelatable in that idea that they didn't, they just didn't connect with the idea that a certain, like someone, it was of a high school teacher that was assassinated, and they just didn't connect with that idea that could even happen. There's kind of a strange criticism, but I do get that point in that, like, if something is too outlandish, too crazy, too out of the realm of it could happen in, I guess, Europe or the US, mainly the US is the big market that everyone's trying to crack in terms of podcasts, then maybe it doesn't resonate in such a way. But yeah, I mean, that's something that I find really interesting. And I find the idea of distribution really interesting because it seems to me such a dark art, right? It seems like something that you can put a lot of energy into. I've never really had good success with paid ads. I find that like the most success you can kind of have is to appear in people's articles, right? So we've had good traction beyond the first one that I mentioned in terms of having an actual distribution partner, which will, you'll go on their YouTube channel and all that sort of stuff. That's great. The other side is just to appear in certain articles. And there's a bunch of like newsletters and podcasts. I mean, there's a whole host of them now, even focused on Africa, where they're looking for content probably every day. And if you hit them up and say, hey, we've got a podcast project, would you like, and maybe even send them some stuff and some kind of PR copy, people are looking for that sort of content. So that's definitely a way to sort of do that. The thing that people always mention, which isn't really relevant to this kind of investigative podcast sort of forum, is guest trade. So if you run a weekly chat podcast, right, about a certain topic, say you do climate change in Africa and you talk every week about that, then there's a good chance that you could kind of phone up a different podcast host and producer and say, hey, you be on my podcast, I'll be on your podcast. It's even easier if you run something a bit more flippant, like a comedy podcast, right? Like, you have networks of comedy podcasts that all just basically appear on everyone else's shows. And that's the ecosystem. And that's not something that you can really lean into if you're producing 6 episodes that you take a long time to produce. There's no room to have a guest like on one of those episodes where someone's just rambling about whatever. So in the past, this never really took off, but we sort of experimented with having a chat podcast that was sort of a partner podcast to kind of absorb that. So to kind of be like, okay, we'll have a current affairs weekly chat podcast, and then that will sort of promote the investigative work. Turned out that obviously, as you can guess, that took a lot of work. And there wasn't really the resources to make someone was essentially a PR exercise with that much effort. I mean, I would have liked to have done that, but like it didn't really work out. So, but that is a great way, right? And you'll hear that all the time, like people talking about. So you might be able to get on other people's weekly chat podcast to promote your investigative series. but you might not, depending on where you work or what your environment is, you might not have a vehicle to be able to return the favor. And that's, that's just something you're gonna have to negotiate, because that's essentially how it's working at the moment, right? Like people are one-for-one kind of trading in that guest ecosystem. The other sort of sector is obviously paying for adverts on anywhere from YouTube to Facebook, but also on other podcasts. Because the thing is that I'm sure you're all aware is that and especially as Spotify kind of strengthens its grip, is people need an app. They need to be in the app, and that's not something that lends itself to just casually browsing. They need to be in the app and kind of listening to something with kind of intent. And that's what makes the whole podcast experience great, but it's also its biggest downfall in that sense. So you can kind of experiment with all these different things. And I'd love to hear if people have anything to say about this now, like please chime in. Otherwise, once you get your podcast kind of up and running in the future, then I'd love to hear from you, if it over WhatsApp or over email in the group or just directly to me. So is there do people have any thoughts on promotion, on distribution, if it's stuff they've done or just thoughts they've had that might work, anything like that?
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Penny.
Hi, Penny.
Very successful, but my biggest challenge when we looked at podcasts a year and a bit ago was obviously how we were going to monetize it or get an income out of it. And because it was featured on the local radio, the audience is small, we had to do it locally. And what we found was that during a series that was applicable, a podcast, we'd get a sponsor. So before, rather than add, says this podcast is sponsored by whatever. And how they distributed it was there were a huge audience with WhatsApp groups. So the link was shared with WhatsApp groups. And I know with one podcast, it went viral. That's how, it was shared in so many ways in that platform. So WhatsApp was a huge platform to share the podcast. And I know I've got friends in the UK, in the BBC and that, and they just said that my accent was very painful.
Yeah.
These audience.
Yeah.
Sister who lives in Sydney. She just said, "Yikes! I'd rather just listen. Read your transcript and listen."
Wow.
Broadcasting voice. If your story is very catchy, which that one was very relevant and it was very popular. Obviously, they'll surpass it. But with the WhatsApp audience, the time of the podcast was very important to keep it quite short. They found that we made a small podcast. But anyway, it was a big challenge, the revenue. And locally, they distributed it on the community, and the community radios found huge success with stories that were relevant in the community, and they managed to find revenue with sponsors on that.
So, thanks, Penny. That's so interesting. Just a couple of things. Did you say that, were you saying that the sponsor is the people, they were distributing it, right? So you had a sponsor and then they were distributing. Oh, it was the radio station that was distributing it. Okay. Right. Sorry.
And some of the one investigative story they posted was all the relevant ratepayers forums, all the the associations that obviously that were relevant in the community, and they had massive reach. So that's how they were able to distribute it. And then when they saw their reach, they were obviously able to pull sponsors to go onto that. So that's how that was a draw card for them to monetize it.
Yeah, very interesting. And the WhatsApp distribution is very interesting because we did a show, we still runs, but in one of my other sort of entities like Volume, they do like corporate podcasts, and we did What's Crap on WhatsApp, which is this podcast that distributes over WhatsApp, and we had pretty good figures. But the trouble, the thing is that we had to, basically we had someone that was manning like broadcast lists to distribute the show, and they didn't distribute a link because we felt that that was also we experimented with a few things. Like we did a link to like a podcast, like in a normal sort of sense, but we also distributed it as an embedded voice note on WhatsApp. And that I think was much more successful. But the flip side of that is we were never able to find out if it was actually successful, because you don't have any oversight on the listens of a voice note, right? So people can share it, people can go wild with it. You never find out if no one listen, even if no one's listening to it, you don't even find that out. We kind of guessed that people were listening to it because of the way we were getting feedback, but I think people liked that idea, like, you know, it's like a voice note that's coming to you in the same way that you would get one from your mum, basically, right? It's just like, oh, here's a voice note, I can click on this. It's not like they had to click on a link that would open another window or another app or anything like that. Not that that's such a big deal, but you know what I mean? It was creating something that was also much more data friendly, because people had WhatsApp, and still do, like WhatsApp subscriptions, which is essentially you pay a flat fee to your service provider. I don't know how many other countries do this, but like it's quite common in South Africa that you obviously get this like flat subscription for WhatsApp. Then everything that comes through WhatsApp is paid for, so you don't have any data costs beyond your subscription. And obviously that becomes much more appealing if you're sending them a link and they have to go out WhatsApp, then it's not appealing. But if you're sending something that's internal, then they're like, oh, great, I can listen to this because it's internal. But the oversight eventually just becomes such a huge stumbling block, because you talk to a donor or I guess a sponsor or something, and they try and dig into your numbers, and you've got these subscribers on WhatsApp. But then when they ask the important question of like, do we know if anyone is listening to this? You're like, no, we don't. And obviously then with like, that's the whole advantage of digital media, right? Is you do know, like you should know. And WhatsApp simultaneously is so convenient, but also like is a complete black box in that way. Yeah, but super. And I'm sorry to hear about your accent. Yeah.
Obviously, you can use your social media to the comments.
Yes.
You know, you can. I think it's just another avenue.
Yes.
You know, it's a hard audience to crack up. You know, trying to monetize it is a big challenge. If you can't get onto the big news sites, you can help with the distribution.
Yeah, all the radio stations, right? I mean, that's also great. I mean, like I think, yeah.
To have a lot of dead space. So if people are battling to find a platform, it's a good way to approach them. Because when I approached the local radio stations, they were so happy to do it. They obviously didn't pay me because, you know, for me, I did an exchange. I said, you know, you take it out there, and in exchange, obviously, I get a little bit of the of the thing out there, the product. So it was a bit of an exchange. But then when I saw how popular it was, they realized it was something. So there's a lot of dead space with radio stations, and they're very happy to accept content, for sure.
That's great. That's really cool. I'm going to go into the task, just to talk about the task for today a little bit. If anyone else has any other thoughts or comments about this, has anyone else got any other thoughts? Okay. Oh, I think so. Yes.
Paul, I just want to ask Penny a question.
Yeah, sure. Go for it. Yeah.
I can hardly hear her anyway. So Penny, I just wanted to know this podcast that you gave to your local radios. How long was it? Because I find it for most of our radios, they have their own content and they don't share content from other people. So I just wanted to know how long was your content.
So I did it in series, but it wasn't more than 10 minutes. That's how, because obviously that's how I started originally. When I said they didn't want it long, because obviously they said that they needed a short podcast so they can keep their audience attention. So I didn't want it longer than 12 to 15 minutes.
Wow, nice. Please share that link so that we can also learn a thing or two about it. Thank you.
I will.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Yeah, and that's a great point, right? Is if you're kind of moving it to being like in the radio space, like what we talked about last week, like the sense of like time and how long everything is becomes so much more important. Okay, I wanted to go quickly into this task that I thought was very useful. It's kind of like I find this stuff quite painful to do, which is kind of why I wanted to sort of introduce it. This idea of audience research, and I think it comes more naturally, and people are more comfortable with it than others. But I've always struggled with this idea of like you are creating something you kind of like and you want to do, and the idea that even before it gets done, or it might get shut down. It's fine working with like maybe 1 or 2 editors and you get to know them, but this idea that you will kind of put something out there in that way, and then an audience will kind of determine what stories you choose. Maybe I know that's how a lot of newsrooms now are slowly working more and more in terms of community engagement and all sorts of other things that we'll talk a little bit about tomorrow. But I wanted to encourage this idea of thinking about audience research, because when we've done it in the past, it's really helped. It's been massively helpful, and it isn't something that you have to do. Like I said in the task, it's not something that you have to do over a huge number of people. You can really cherry pick who you want to send it to. I mean, not like your friends and family, but like of the people that like maybe of loyal listeners or people that you know in that way. It can really help to kind of use those people that you have maybe emailed you in the past. Just, oh, we really like your website or your content or whatever it is, and just ask them if they would like to answer a few questions. Obviously, when you blow something out a little bit larger, you can start to incorporate people that are less fan-based, because there are advantages to doing something, as I'm sure is obvious, like something very fan-based, in that the advantage is that they will spend time and probably say yes and actually answer quite thorough questions. But the disadvantage is they will give you criticism, but they're already on board with you, right? So you're not going to get like, this was terrible, which you don't want to hear, but sometimes that can be a bit more constructive than this is terrible, and you kind of need to bring that on board. So, but for this task anyway, just to think small group super fans, as they kind of call them in these sorts of spaces, and to kind of think about, you might not be able to get the whole thing done definitely today or by tomorrow, but I just want to kind of, for you to kind of start thinking about this as a tool and how you might use it, and kind of what kind of questions you would ask. I mean, you know, on the one side, you have this ability to ask, like, would you like corruption stories? Would you like this? You know, you can dictate that. If you don't feel, if you're actually not going to, you need to also be honest with the idea of what you're going to use. If you don't want someone to dictate what kind of stories, if you have a sense of the stories you want to tell and you don't want input on that, then frankly, don't ask that. Would be my suggestion. Like, but it is good to even get, obviously you might, if they are super fans, you'll probably know like their name and maybe have a guess at their age and things like that. But it's good to know those things, like basic demographics. Then sort of the idea of their other media consumption is really good to know. And this will feed into what we're going to talk about tomorrow, is this idea of if they pay for any media, because that's something that like is increasingly, as everyone is aware, is increasingly becoming the model for these things, right? Is that people pay a couple of dollars to a bunch of different things, and essentially you're after people that are already paying a couple of dollars to something else, because they're probably more likely then to, you know, pay for something that you are producing as well. So that sort of feeds into, obviously there's ad models, there's all those sorts of things, but this idea of getting your dedicated consumers to pay a few dollars is something that kind of comes out of this idea of audience research. It's not something that you want to do heavy-handed when you do your audience research, to be like, we're basically after your money. But if you're making a list of 10 questions, that can also help. I can share, I tell you what might be useful. I'll try and dig out and share some audience research that we did a couple of years ago, and we did it around much more, as I was saying, like corporate podcasts. So not really around, not around like investigative stuff, but I think it might help. I'll export it as a PDF and I'll drop it in the group. Does anyone have any thoughts or comments or anything to say around audience research that they might have done in the past or they think might be helpful? I've put a link there to just Google Forms, which is kind of what I use. Obviously, you can use anything, but it's a pretty handy program that's obviously free to use with a Google account. Okay, well, if no one's got any extra things to say on that, then yeah, I'll leave it there. Give it some thought, and allow this to kind of be a good space to kind of think around like some of the distribution strategies that we've mentioned here, but also that way of like, I'm always fascinated, and I think it's worth thinking about this idea of like editorial feeding into what is popular and what people want to hear. And, you know, and obviously there's a noble thing of that, like the news that, or whatever, stories that people are desperate to know about and like hold people accountable and are like in the public interest. But there's also like, as we all know, a dark side of this kind of stuff where people, it's a bit of a race to the bottom in terms of what people really listen to and read and all that stuff. And often you don't want to do those things, right? You know, there's sort of there is sort of an ambition to do stories that maybe in a weird way are not the most popular stories. And I find that tension so interesting in that idea that you can, and obviously we call it clickbait, even without it being clickbait, just like incredibly easy to read and enticing and maybe like pop celeb gossip type stories. Like, I don't want to make those, but I also kind of want the popularity and the listens and the clicks of the things that those things get. And I think that tension is really interesting. And it's not to say, obviously, we all know, like, you know, there are very successful investigative units that get good funding and good sponsors and good reach and go viral and all that kind of stuff. But I feel that tension of good journalism and popularity is confusing and like worth exploring and worth thinking about. And then on the other side, not to be despondent if your series does not go get crazy numbers, because let's face it, like popularity in this day and age is not an indication of good quality, right? You know, even though when your thing does do good numbers, you like to think that that's the case. Anyway, I've spoken enough. Thank you so much for everything. If you guys have other tasks from elsewhere in the week or this one, please send them through to me. But as always, especially for this one, in terms of the Google Forms and that, you know, feel free to share them in the group and to ask other people about what questions. It'd be great if people can have a sense of what questions other people are asking of their audience. But yeah, thanks very much. I'll see you guys tomorrow.
Sorry, Paul, before you go.
Oh yeah, sure.
I have opened the Google document that you sent.
Yes.
And what are those forms entitled? Because I'm seeing something different. I don't know whether it's me. I have so many things or what. Like what are the titles of the forms? Because I'm seeing.
You will start a form, like, so you'll like create a new form, like you would create a new document. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So you've given us examples.
No, I haven't given examples yet. I'll send you. That's just the link in the email is just the generic link to Google Forms, but I'll send an example on PDF to the group a bit later.
Okay, Paul. Sorry.
No, it's fine.
What is in that Google whatever? Because I'm seeing a couple of things here. Did you send? Does it have a couple of forms in it?
That's probably what maybe they're forms that you have had shared with you. They'll just be linked to your Google account, right? So it'll be like, maybe it'll be forms that you have worked on or had shared with you in the past that are now like appearing there, perhaps.
Yes, yeah, that's why I was wondering whether I have the right link or not. Now I understand. Sorry, Paul. Thank you.
No worries. No worries. That's totally fine. Cool. Thank you so much, everyone. I'll chat to you tomorrow. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thanks.